Today we're finding out, is AMD's RX590 actually deserving of the name, or is the Fat Boy genuinely just a disappointment? Right, so after many requests to actually take a look at this graphics card, I've gone and bought an RX590, a card that I don't really look very fondly at for a couple of reasons. Number one being the price. This today cost me £61. And that's considered a good buy on one of these, given they're about £85 to £100 over on CEX and other places that are still selling these by it now. This is technically a good deal, so why don't we get this open and actually see what the RX590 is. Now, this is meant to be one of the better variants. I don't think it's the poster boy, which I think was the Red Devil or something like that, but this is meant to be the XFX version, which was called the Fat Boy. But I'd say this is fairly reminiscent of the price you'd be able to get these for if you get something that's called a deal. It's not like the RX580 where you can pick them up for 20 quid. It's a bit more difficult this year. And here is the RX590. What a card. Rebrand of a rebrand, die shrunk and sold with the name that would imply it's a flagship, but it's actually just a mid-range card. And to be fair, condition-wise, it looks fine. I don't know why it's got the name the Fat Boy, because it's not actually that big. It's slightly bigger than 2 slots. Comparing it to an actual flagship, all they've done is make it slightly wider than it needs to be. It's actually not very big whatsoever. It's just a normal size graphics card. It looks about the size of a 7970. But this is the RX590, so why don't we get this plugged in? I'm not going to complain too much because I want to actually test the performance first to actually get some figures, because I could be wrong. I could be being too pessimistic, but I have some interesting thoughts on this about why I don't think it even deserves the name it has, yet alone the price tag that it goes for. Let's whack in RX590. Does it need any extra power connectors? Yes, it does actually need, now compared to the RX480, which I'm fairly sure is one 8-pin, it now needs an 8-pin and a 6-pin, which bodes well. So much for power efficiency, I suppose. What's the bet this is overvolted to high heavens from the factory? That wouldn't be like AMD in this era at all. No. I already have controversial enough thoughts on the 580, but at least it gives more stock to the market. These are just odd. They didn't even release in an era where there were GPU shortages. I think the reason they got a good reputation is people that bought them in the shortages thought they were amazing. But it does amaze me. People are spending more on this card than they are on Vega and things like that, purely because of the name. Which is something that happens with graphics cards. You'll often find lower performing cards selling for higher prices because they have the name going with them. Yeah, hopefully this card hasn't been mined on, but given it's the 590 and it came out a little bit towards the end of the mining craze, not suffered with mining at all. We will get some drivers. We will test modded drivers, of course, at the end of the video. We're going to use the stock AMD drivers for now because they are they're more stable and they're more consistent. Because one of the main things I want to do is I want to get a baseline figure. I want to see just how it performs out of the box. I have never used one of these, and there are always people in the comments saying they got one, they love them, they're fantastic. Why am I not talking about these? 60 quid is a lot of money to ops. This is into Vega territory. Maybe even a good deal on a GTX 1070. They are around double the price of your standard RX480, RX580 card. That's quite a big asking price for a card that is the exact same. So we're going to find out if the tweaks they've made, the 12 nanometers, is actually worth it, and then if it's not, or at least if it doesn't look like it, I'm going to do some complaining, because I had some strong thoughts on launch, and I've not really ever shared them on this channel, I don't think, so we'll get round to it. They have actually had a security update as of yesterday. So there has actually been a security update for these drivers, and there is a new version out as of yesterday, so that's nice to see. So that'll be Vega, Polaris actually getting an update, probably their first update in 2026. Did they launch that on? They did also launch that on Windows 10, so you've got nothing to worry about there. Oh right, of course I paid for a business line so that Fortnite updates could take up all of my internet. Given that I believe these are just bug fixes and security updates, I can't imagine it's going to make all too much difference over the performance we've already seen from previous Polaris cards. It's at least they're still getting updates of some form. Now, a lot of modern APIs at least don't rely too much on the drivers, not as much as they did back in the DirectX 11 days. I think we just go straight through 3D Mark, get a baseline figure on temperatures, performance, and overall score, just how it works out of the box, and then we can see how it compares to its predecessors, the 580 and the 480, and also in terms of actual comparisons, cards it's actually competing with, like Vega 56. Vega 56 right now It cost me £56. RX 590 series, Polaris 30, which is just Polaris 10 on 12nm rather than 14nm, 2304 shaders, exactly the same. These only came as 8GB variants, which I suppose is something they've got going for them, and everything else checks out. Keep in mind, XFX once used to be Pine. Maybe they bought Pine or Pine bought them. This is related to the 3D Phantom. Maybe because of this card we should keep this here. Actually, we'll award that later if it is actually as disappointing as I've been led to believe by the specifications and the news of its launch. Okay, performance off the bat is pretty decent, 28 FPS to 30. We'll see if the cooler actually is any good. I mean, they call it a Fat Boy, but it just seems to be a load of plastic to make it look bigger than it really is. Right, we'll let it run through 3D Mark, get a performance score at the end of it, and then we'll see if we can tweak around and fix the problems it comes with while I complain about its existence, because honestly, not looking immensely better than the RX480 at the moment. Maybe some undervolting and a bit of tweaking could help. Well, being the Fat Boy, it apparently outperforms the average RX 590. I don't know how good that really is. Better result than I was expecting. It peaks out at around 80 degrees, 82 degrees, 200 watts. Well, just south of that, 196.8 watts. Right, so its main competition, the RX 580, which scores about the same as an RX 480, 4,532, 4,879. So it scores 300 points better than the 580. 3,000 points less than a Vega 56 that cost the same money. Keep in mind the Vega 56 here was undervolted and using less power than this. Where do we begin? We'll do an undervolt because I'm not disappointed too much by that performance, but it could be a lot nicer. Let's increase the power limit first of all. So far, double the price, not double the performance. At least on Vega 56 you could argue that it was, at least in a benchmark, double the performance. Voltage doesn't look too bad, but I mean look at these power states down here. It just jumps 1068 to 1150, 1150, 1150, 1150, 1150. Just something that's going to keep the clock stable would be nice. That's all I'm looking for. 1070 on voltage has brought our power consumption down dramatically. Can it do 1068 and just copy the power state from there all the way along? Are we stable? Yes, we are stable. We're down to 144 to 147 watts under full load. We are now sticking almost religiously to our actual targeted clock speed. 1050 millivolts across the range. We brought power consumption down to 140 from just north of 200 watts, and ideally that means our clock speed will stay the same throughout a benchmark, and then we can look at the results. Not only have they given it 300 extra points performance, which is a percentage increase, if that, over the previous generation, it's marketed like a flagship, it's named like a flagship, yet it's set up with the same problems, to be fair, that were exaggerated by the RX 580. So let me tell you some of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the 590. It was a rebrand of a rebrand. The RX 480 was rebranded the 580 with more voltage pumped into it, and the 590, as we've just seen, is that exact card die shrunk. It's the exact same specifications otherwise, and then with even more voltage pumped into them. All just to say we get 2 frames per second more than our previous generation. It's named like a flagship, but it has the same specifications as the mid-range. And also, and this is the big kicker for me, see, there was actually a high-end Polaris card. The Xbox One X had in it a Polaris card with more CUs enabled than any of the other Polaris cards in the generation. So when they announced the RX 590, I was thinking, oh great, they could just literally release the Xbox One X's graphics card as a standalone desktop card, and then suddenly you've got a Polaris flagship. Now, of course, in hindsight, you've got to remember that they don't want to encroach too much on their Vega cards. They were just trying to use up spare fab space, which I do understand, but what they've given us is pretty much just a rebrand of a rebrand. You can get very similar performance to this, at least in a benchmark, out of a standard RX 480, which came out 2.5 years before this one did. And just the name scheme is just wrong. But anyway, that's enough of my complaining for now. We know it works, we know it undervolts, we know that it's performing okay, and this is one of the better ones on the market. It's time to actually carry on with the rest of the video. So there may be some people that aren't familiar with the RX 480, the RX 580, or especially the RX 590, so what exactly is it? Well, the RX 590 was the final Polaris release in the lineup, well, at least the final meant to be top of the line, this is as far as Polaris goes, graphics card that AMD released. It's based on GCN4 being the Polaris 30 version, which is just a 12nm version of Polaris 10 from the previous generation. There was also some quite rare 11nm versions, but I have yet to ever come across one. They apparently do exist. It has 8GB of GDDR5 RAM as standard, which is a nice uplift given you could get the previous generation in 4GB, a 256-bit memory bus, and drivers are still up to date as of 2026 with bug fixes and security. You get 2,304 cores, 144 TMUs, and 32 ROPs. As of the moment, I've had no problems with DirectX 12 or Vulkan support, and power consumption places it at anywhere from 150 to 230 watts, depending on if you're running this thing stock, or if you're gaming or trying to run a power virus on it like Furmark. You can pick them up today for anywhere from £60 to £90, sometimes cheaper than this, but mostly over than this, because this graphics card, it's a bit of a weird one. See, I've already made my thoughts pretty clear on it, because you'd think a Polaris flagship, well, I can understand why AMD wouldn't want to bring the Xbox One X's graphics card to the market, because it'd probably encroach too close onto their Vega flagships. But at the same time, the name scheme for this card is entirely wrong, the entire purpose of this card is entirely wrong, and it's an RX580 on 12nm or 11nm if you come across one of those. It doesn't fix any of the problems, it's just another way for AMD to say, look, if we push a ton more voltage and a ton more power consumption into a graphics card, it can beat the GTX 1060 by another 2 frames per second. It didn't work very well, and that's pretty much the entire reason this card exists. AMD's constant quest of the era to say, we've got something better than the 1060, please buy it. The thing is though, when it comes to actually comparing the results of an Undervolt on this graphics card, it's very much like the RX580, where it's mostly stability and less frame drops, as well as lower power consumption and better thermals, is the reason to do this. It's not like the RX480 or the Vega cards, where you do get a sizable increase in performance by actually undervolting them. So there are advantages to undervolting, mostly longevity, cooler, stable frame rates. There's a reason to undervolt them, but in terms of actual overall performance, we saw around 20 points extra in 3D Mark, and to give you an idea of how it compares on the market, it's between a normal R9 Fury and an R9 Nano, which is a Fury X that is cut down to run on an air cooler. So it's pretty much bang into where you'd expect to be on AMD's lineup. It matched their last generation flagships, and is ever so slightly better than an RX 580 or a GTX 1060. That's about as exciting as it gets for the 3D Mark results. As much as this is a new process and a new version of Polaris, it's pretty much the exact same as the old version, and the graph isn't lying to you. But that's enough ranting and complaining and actually talking about this out of the way. At the end of the day, the RX590 is a graphics card that regularly pops up being mentioned in the comments as a really good and viable option. Some people actually buying these over the equivalent priced Vega cards, given these are now more expensive than the Vega cards. Why are people doing this? I'm guessing it's just the RX name was so good at the time that people see it as being better than it really is. Now, I had no luck overclocking on these. I know some people do like to overclock them and see how much further they can go, but for me, personally, undervolting was the best thing this one could do. Maybe it's already been overclocked and it's been cooked up and it just doesn't want to go beyond these clocks. Who knows? At the end of the day, we are doing all of these results with a 3700X Ryzen chip, 32 gigs of RAM, and the latest driver release from earlier in the week. So this is pretty much this is the performance you could expect to get if you went out and bought one of these cards to use. You will get the same performance I'm showing in this video. At the end of the day, I have also gone through and retested the 580 and the 480 for after the benchmarks to prove a point. But at the same time, this is a £60 graphics card, we've got some new benchmarks, we've got some popular titles. Just how is the RX590 holding up, and is it better than the figures and the specs and everything else about it might lead us to believe in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which we are running with the very high preset in 1440p. Now, some of you may ask, why are you testing in 1440p when most of the benchmarks are going to be in 1080p? Well, the reason for this is, It's an RX 480, 580, 590, it's the same card. They all run GTA 5 very well at 1080p at well over 60 FPS with these settings. So this is just to put some load on the card and to give you some results that maybe show you just how the card would get on in 1440p. 51 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 48 FPS, which returned a very nice looking game with some clear visuals, a good resolution and a solid frame rate. Over in the world of GTA Online Enhanced, we have the same settings, and we did see actually a better overall average frame rate. This was even in a large lobby with over 16 players in it, so this caught me off guard, but this is how GTA Online used to run back in the day. It did used to run better. We did see some slightly worse frame times, but nothing really too drastic, so at the end of the day, GTA Online or GTA 5 with the Enhanced Edition runs completely fine in either a 1080p or 1440p resolution. Honestly, you have enough headroom here that you could probably even go up to 4K, and it wouldn't be a problem. Then again, you could also do that on the RX 480. Not that we will be doing all too many older benchmarks today, but GTA 5 Legacy can also run with very high settings plus AMD CHS shadows enabled, also in a 1440p resolution. Now, given this game was kind of designed to run on these cards, well, this card was designed to run these games, it's no surprise that it does in fact run very well, with 67 FPS on average, although slightly worse frame times than we saw in the Enhanced Edition, likely owing to the DirectX 11 renderer. That's something, I mean, Polaris deals with it okay, but not as well as the Pascal cards from Nvidia do of this generation. At the same time, the game looked absolutely fantastic with no issues in frame times, and the good news is that even as finicky as GTA Online's Legacy version is, even with the same settings we're using, so very high plus AMD CHS shadows with the 1440p resolution, we saw 62 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 50 FPS overall. So it does still run, and it does technically run better than the Enhanced Edition, but it just didn't feel as smooth with those frame times. Still, they're not bad frame times, they're really rather good. Just compared to the Enhanced Edition, the game was noticeably less smooth. Maybe though, the RX590 has some hidden tricks up its sleeve that mean that new Unreal 5 engine based games just run brilliantly on it in a way they didn't on previous Polaris cards. So Oblivion Remastered with low and medium settings in 1080p just about ran okay at 35 FPS, with 1% lows down to 27 FPS. Honestly, with a 30 FPS cap in place, this likely wouldn't be too bad, but at the same time, it's just dealing with it the same way Polaris always does. It is worth noting that FSR does work surprisingly well in this title, so rather than dropping the resolution, if you set this to performance mode and upscale it again, you can see just shy of 60 FPS during most instances outside, and a confirmed and locked 60 FPS when you're in smaller towns, locations, or inside caves or dungeons. So at the same time, Oblivion Remastered does work, but it's about the same Polaris experience you'd expect, where FSR is recommended to get you nearer to that 60 FPS mark. So you have the overhead for it, and it's one of the few times where I'm going to recommend to use it. Now, these cards always dealt with Cyberpunk 2077 way better than you would have expected. You can run the games with the high preset as long as you're enabling medium or low textures. Personally, I'd recommend medium, as there doesn't seem to be too much of a performance hit between low or medium when you're utilizing them on these cards, and you can return 40 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 33 FPS. This is a reading that is taken from the built-in benchmark, and once again, just to confirm that this performance is accurate because it can wildly vary from system to system, it is the exact same frame rate you're liable to see in-game, where when lots is going on you're going to be close to that 30 FPS mark, but when not much is happening you'll be in and around the 40 to 45 FPS region. The thing is, Cyberpunk 2077 does have one of the few good implementations of FSR that exist. It's still not particularly great compared to DLSS, but it does work. So you can enable FSR with the balance mode and bump this up to a 58 FPS average, with 1% lows down to 51 FPS. There is notably less ghosting in this implementation than there is in Oblivion Remastered, which is something that's nice to see, and is something that I may actually recommend if you're looking to play that on this card. At the same time, you can drop it down to 720p natively and achieve just over 60 FPS, but really, the FSR option painfully, and it does pain me to say this, did look better. Counter-Strike 2 does still suffer with the same issues it does on all GCN cards, and the bug fixes and optimizations that have been released even this year have not come round to fix this.
During your first time loading up a map, you will be faced with a good few minutes of stutters, which will completely go away after you've played the map for the first time. Then when you reload it, it'll just work, so keep that in mind if you do go down this route. During the built-in benchmark map, we saw 204 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 178 FPS, while utilising competitive settings in a 1080p resolution. It's worth noting here that this is pretty much perfect performance for playing this game competitively, and I did go ahead and test this game in newer maps like Nuke, and we saw the exact same frame rate. So it's worth noting that Counter-Strike 2 works perfectly on these cards, although there is no sizable increase in performance over just running it on the previous generation Polaris cards. So it'll work, and we weren't CPU limited before anyone suggests that. Yes, this is one of the instances where we are nearing in on it, but we were still limited by the RX590. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds does respond incredibly well to these cards when utilising DirectX 12, and did help actually reduce the overall amount of stuttering. Not that it was perfect when you left the game running uncapped, even with high settings and a 1080p resolution. We did see 89 FPS on average, but the 1% lows, as you can see there, do indicate that there was some stuttering, and you can probably see it in the footage you're seeing right now. Now, there are solutions to fix this, but the best recommendation I have is to cap the game at 70 FPS internally, and then cap the game externally at 60 FPS. I don't know whether this has been introduced during a recent update to PUBG, as it doesn't feel like something I used to have to do on these AMD cards, but it does help stabilize the frame rate ever so slightly. I say ever so slightly, it brings your frame times up to being a near perfect and locked 60 FPS experience. So PUBG does work and is actually more enjoyable with a 60 FPS cap in place, but if you are searching for the highest frame rate, you may be able to achieve better than this with low settings, but I can't imagine your frame times are going to thank you all too much. BeamNG was unfortunately downloading a newer update, so do keep in mind this version that we're testing today is a couple of versions out of date. However, I haven't noticed any noticeable performance change between this version and the latest release, so that it does have that going for it. This performance should be the same in the latest patch, but I haven't had time to complete the new update yet. With very high settings in 1080p, we saw a pretty much perfect experience with 56 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 53 FPS. Keep in mind this is in one of the more intensive maps there is, so simpler situations and scenarios could net you anywhere from 70 to 120 FPS, depending on how little was actually going on. You've got enough VRAM there that turning on things like traffic and things like that is entirely feasible and won't make a dent in your average or your 1% lows. So BeamNG, pretty much a perfect experience, but you can't quite manage Ultra unless you don't mind going closer to the 30 FPS region. This is a game we haven't tested before with Fortnite, so if you're wondering how it's performing on the RX480, RX580 or the RX590, they're all going to be within a margin of each other. Sorry if that spoils a section later on in the video. With medium and high settings in DirectX 12, which are the settings it pre-selected for us, we saw 112 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 93 FPS. This was a very smooth experience, and a lot of the time when not much was going on, it was pretty much sticking entirely to the 120 FPS cap that the game had in place for us. So this paired with a FreeSync monitor, and you're looking at an experience that would be quite competitive in Fortnite. I don't actually know how to be competitive in Fortnite. I don't know how to really play the game very well at all. So I suppose if you were someone that actually knew how to play this game, you'd do pretty well on this card, on this type of system. I mean, 112 FPS is certainly nothing to scoff at in a competitive scenario. Red Dead Redemption 2, I just left it with the default settings. This game is a nightmare to configure, but it does actually detect the settings you should use really rather well. And it detected us with a mixture of high and ultra settings in 1080p. And this time I ran through the built-in benchmark. I don't know what was happening, but usually we test this game online so we can get into free roam quicker. But in this instance, I'm assuming something was down with matchmaking on the day I tested, because I did try again later, and I still couldn't actually get into a session. So at the same time, the built-in benchmark returned us 56 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 46 FPS. Keep in mind that a lot of the time this would be pretty much running perfectly fine at anywhere between the 50 to 60 FPS region when lots was going on, and when not much was going on, it was pretty much in and around 60 to 70 FPS. So Red Dead 2 looks and runs great, but we should expect this from a Polaris card, especially one that came out, I'm fairly sure, the exact year this game did. The new anniversary update to Fallout 4 does actually mean the game uses a bit more VRAM than it used to, at least from the testing I've done on it so far, but that means on cards like this, where we have 8 gigs available to us, it's working pretty fantastic with a locked 60 FPS, even with ultra settings used. So it's worth noting that cap being in place is certainly a good thing, because our card was nearly at 100% utilization the entire time we were playing and testing the game. The benchmark is of course done in a built-up area where lots is happening, combat, bits and pieces like that. So Fallout 4 worked perfectly fine, ultra settings no problems. It's nice to see that they have at least optimized it for these newer systems. It's just a shame that it is now suffering on older cards. But then again, this isn't classed as an older card, it's still getting driver updates and it's still very popular, and it's something that developers are still targeting for today, so you're pretty much having no problems there with these older games that do get updated. Always a very requested game, and one that is very popular on the Steam charts with Rust, where with the high preset and medium textures, which was just textures set on half, in a 1080p resolution, once the world had actually loaded in and we could continue playing, we saw that it worked really rather well with 56 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 48 FPS. Now it's worth noting these figures were taken from whatever weird jungle it spawned us next to, which did prove remarkably more intensive than just an open flat bit of grass. So it's worth noting that this Rust benchmark is actually taken from quite a demanding area of the game. These figures are also combined with the built-in benchmark, which returned the exact same figures, so it's good to know that Rust, you're looking at it hovering around the 60 FPS mark, or going just under this when something intensive is happening. The latest release of Hitman has always responded really well to these AMD cards. It doesn't matter whether you're on GCN 1 or GCN 4, it does perform remarkably well. And this was one of the few instances where we saw the RX590 scaling how I'd imagine AMD 1 marketed it as doing, and 2 hoped it would, where with medium and high settings plus the best options enabled in a 1080p resolution, we saw 77 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 74 FPS. Genuinely, the frame times were that good while running it. So Hitman is probably one of the best examples of where an RX 590 must have made sense. In a real, well, not a real world, in an ideal use case world where all games are optimized this well and scaled this well to the architectures and the clock speed available, you do actually get some performance increase. That's about it really. Hitman runs well. I was really hoping that the latest patch, which did include some bug fixes, may actually enable the Vulkan mode for these cards in Baldurs Gate 3. But that just locks up the entire system still. Sometimes it would crash the game, most of the time it would lock up the system, didn't matter how the graphics card was set or what drivers we were using, it just doesn't work. So we're here with DirectX 11 plus high settings and a 50 FPS cap in place. Trust me, it's there because without it the frame times were so stuttery it was more or less unplayable. But with a 50 FPS cap in place, well, you could get away with playing it, and it did reduce a lot of the stuttering. It still wasn't perfect, keep in mind, because DirectX 11 on these cards, well, it really isn't. At the same time, the game looks pretty good. If you could deal with the stuttering or cap it at 30 FPS, it wasn't too bad. To be fair, when I was just trying this without the capture card and utilizing FreeSync, it actually was quite smooth and quite enjoyable. So if you got FreeSync, it's okay. If you don't, 30 FPS cap would definitely be recommended. Just a fun one here with Tiny Glade, which implements its own form of ray tracing, and it's always fun to see how that technology does scale onto these older graphics cards that came out long before the technology was due for actual release or being viable or actually in any games. So it's interesting to see how it performs here. And how did it do? Well, with the quality mode enabled in a 1080p resolution, we saw the game average 71 FPS with good frame times down to 65 FPS as 1% lows. So Tiny Glade, a fun little builder, it's not really a city builder, it's more like a little town or village builder with nice ray tracing and good graphics and good lighting, worked surprisingly well on the RX 590. But finally, can it run Mountain Blade Viking Conquest? I must have forgot to do Crysis, and I know I tested this because Bannerlord was also downloading a 20GB update for some reason, so I couldn't test it. So instead, this is what we're finishing on. Mountain Blade Viking Conquest, Ultra Settings, 8x anti-aliasing, HDR enabled, which apparently is an option here, I'm guessing it's for the balloon, in a 1080p resolution with a 400 soldier-sized battle. something that the system was actually struggling with 55 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 39 FPS. And you know the stupidest thing was? This was actually more intensive for the graphics card than it was for the processor. The processor was able to churn out more frames than this. So yes, Mount & Blade Vikings Conquest, in this absolute abomination of a set of settings, I mean, it still looks... it looks like Mount & Blade, doesn't it? It's never been a pretty game, but you can appreciate sometimes when it does look alright. And Viking Conquest is meant to come with like this HD texture pack, which is actually more intensive than the base game, and, well, it looks like this. Still, the RX590 did struggle with 55 FPS on average, so maybe this is our Crysis now, this awful battle setup. Anyway, that's it. I'd imagine it can run Crysis because the 480 and 580 also ran that fine. So, overall performance of the RX 590. Well, it's more than good enough to run a lot of the popular titles out there. It does deal with AMD's FSR really rather well, which means that a few games go from 30 FPS to just shy of 60 FPS without too much of a visual hit. I'm still not a huge fan of FSR. I think it is quite blurry and ghosty in a lot of titles, with Cyberpunk being one of the few exceptions to the rule, but at the same time, a lot of the most popular titles out there are playable in either 1440p, like GTA 5 and GTA 5 Enhanced, or 1080p with either FSR in brand new Unreal Engine titles, or just a standard 1080p resolution with either high or medium and high settings. So, when it comes down to the real-world performance of the RX 590, it's not bad. It's a 60 quid graphics card that will actually be able to play a lot of the titles you're asking for. The only thing is, as I said, this is very similar to the previous generations of the RX 480 and the RX 580. They are the same card, this is just die shrunk. At the end of the day, when we actually throw those into the mix, because I've gone back and re-benchmarked both cards because I own both of them, there is virtually no performance change at all. It is around 2 or 3 FPS better, depending on the title, Counter-Strike pretty much showing that there's no difference or margin of error between all of them. Fortnite shows a clear linear scale, but it's, 112 against 105 FPS at worst? It's nothing too bad. Fallout 4 ran the exact same on every single one of these cards. So it almost leads me to say, just get whichever one you find, because they're gonna perform very similar. There was one exception to the rule, which was the new version of Hitman, which admittedly is a beautifully optimized title and one that does look great, seems to scale incredibly well with these Polaris cards, showing a clear increase from RX 480 to RX 580 and then RX 590 afterwards. But this was the only title to actually provide us these results. The rest of them, they ran exactly the same. It didn't matter if you added FSR or something like that, generally these cards have got enough headroom that they all see a performance increase from it. It's not like the older generations where you'll lose performance, you can actually gain something by using it here, which is why I included it. So this was the point I wanted to prove. I said this before in my RX 580 video, and now I can say it again in the RX 590 video. These rebrands are pointless. Yes, some people argue that this is a great overclocker, my one wasn't, so at the end of the day, this is the performance I saw, and it's the same performance we saw last year on the 580 and the 480. Maybe there were some extra changes to keep in mind though. Sometimes with these new architectural revisions there are advantages that aren't just overall performance, sometimes in the form of thermals. I mean, this is the RX 590 Fat Boy, and it was almost the poster child of this generation of graphics cards. And thermals are about where you'd expect them to be for a Polaris graphics card. When running Firmark, which acts as a power virus, very much so on these GCN cards, you're seeing the graphics card in the mid 80 degrees without any changes, down to the low 80s with an undervolt, and with a maximum undervolt in the mid 70s. General gaming performance puts it around 81 degrees or 76 with an undervolt. Keep in mind the undervolt results were quieter overall, and the max undervolt hardly had the fans coming on. So in terms of temperatures, can't really say I'm noticing all too much difference. Then again, temperatures, well, they're down to two things, the cooler and the power consumption. And how is the power consumption? Well, 12nm does have a few advantages. Out of the box, they throw them all away completely, with it now using 236 watts at a maximum, but with an undervolt, we can bring it down to a gaming average of just south of 150 watts, which is a 10 watt deficit over the RX 580 and the RX 480, which with modifications usually hovered around the 150 watt mark. So I suppose you could could argue there is some room for improvement when it comes to power consumption that they did make on 12nm. We also achieved a really decent maximum undervolt, which is something that people really enjoy to see, where we got the card returning what was around 75% of its overall performance, but now just using 72 watts. So the one thing I can give 12nm overall is, despite its rather lackluster setup out of the box, it will undervolt incredibly well to the stage where you can get the card using anywhere from 50 to 70 watts while gaming, while still returning 75% of the overall performance, which is really rather admirable, and does show that Polaris, well, even with modifications made, can still go quite far in the world of actual power consumption and returning decent figures with it. There's not a huge deal else to say on this card. I mean, I had no luck overclocking them, but some people did. It really depends on what card you got. In my case, I do believe this card may have been overclocked for a decent chunk of its life, which leads to instability when trying to move the clocks up. It's a shame, but unfortunately it didn't matter whether I tried with older drivers, modified drivers, anything like that, it would just still do the exact same thing. I suppose we could talk about modded drivers, but honestly there wasn't all too much of a change. Once again, it was the standard GTA Online performs better, Counter-Strike performs better, and surprisingly Fortnite performs better. Not really a surprise, these modified drivers were made primarily for use in competitive games. The gains aren't as high as they used to be, given that AMD is still releasing driver updates for these, bug fixes and security, and these modified drivers are still a couple of months out of date behind the official release. So they work, you can get a bit of extra performance in Counter-Strike and things like that, but for Polaris and Vega, honestly, I've had pretty good experiences just using the stock AMD drivers provided. It does also have AMD VCE, but it's the exact same as the RX480 and 580, so it works okay. It'll work okay at its best for actual recording. Streaming at lower bit rates doesn't exactly perform fantastically on AMD VCE, at least not compared to modern Intel and Nvidia offerings. So yeah, there's not really much else to say. Modified drivers are an option, I personally wouldn't go for them. VCE works, and unfortunately my unit doesn't overclock at all. So there we have it, AMD's RX590. And honestly, my thoughts overall, I think it is quite expensive and people are paying for it purely because they've heard, oh, the RX480 is good, the RX580 is good, that must mean the 590 is even better. And to be fair, they're not wrong, it's just at its best 1 or 2 FPS better unless you're playing Hitman. Generally, the RX590 isn't a bad card, but you've got to remember, you could get AMD's next tier up from this, the card they didn't want this to encroach on, the Vega 56, for less money than this. And we tested that last year, and honestly, for £56, it was a good performing card that achieves better frame rates than this at 1440p. So you also get the advantage of HBM there, and those also undervolt quite dramatically to the stage where the power supply, well, you're going to have similar requirements to running a 590 anyway. So I don't think it's a bad card, and I do understand why people are going for these. The graphics card market is already getting a little bit wayward. I mean, I was following eBay auctions last night, and I saw an R9 390 sell for just north of 50 quid, which seems absolutely ridiculous. I saw a HD 7970 sell for just under £30, which is also ridiculous. So, at the same time, if the graphics card market continues with this level of turbulence, then maybe saying if you can get a 590, it's not a bad idea. And if you get one for the same price as a 480 or a 580, then your quid's in. It is the best version of the card. I just think it's a bit of a disappointment because it's named like a flagship, and I still remember being a bit excited during the day that, oh, we could be getting, you know, a big Polaris card. We could actually be getting something that is actually going to be competitive, you know, actually something that isn't Vega. And it never happened. So maybe that was just a pipe dream that was never going to happen, but I think it did leave a sour taste in quite a few people's mouths. One that's now long since gone because this is a decade ago we're talking about, and also, you've got to remember, the people that got these, well, they're still using them today and they are getting along with them fine, so maybe I am being too pessimistic. So I think we'll leave it at that. If you can get an RX 590 for cheap, around 480 or 580 pricing, go for it. If it's too much money, just get the 480, 580 or the GTX 1060 because you're going to see the exact same performance. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, I hope you found this entertaining, and good night.